Thanks for joining us on the program, everyone. We're keeping tabs with events and happenings in the polity. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. On the program today, we're staying with developments in the United States, where President Bola Tinubu will later today address the 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly ongoing in New York. President Tinubu on Monday continued his bilateral relations and met with his counterpart in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Union of Comoros Island on the sidelines of the ongoing UN General Assembly. He's seeking to use these meetings to seek more investments and promote mutual collaborations between Nigeria and the global community. And earlier today, the U.S. President Joe Biden also talked to world leaders at the annual UN General Assembly, saying that they must stand together against Russia. On climate, President Biden says he's treating it as an existential threat and that the world needs to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow leaders, about a week ago, I stood on the other side of the world, in Vietnam, on soil once bloody with war. And I met a small group of veterans, Americans and Vietnamese, who witnessed, and I watched the exchange of personal artifacts from that war, identification cards and a diary. It was deeply moving to see the reaction of the Vietnamese and American soldiers. Culmination of 50 years of hard work on both sides to address the painful legacies of war and to choose to work together toward peace and a better future.
U.S. President Joe Biden there at the UN General Assembly in New York. Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is at the meeting of nearly 200 countries. Is due to speak later, and this will be the first time the Ukrainian president will be addressing world leaders physically since the war began. I'm joined now by Alao Abiodun, a journalist and a fellow of the United Nations Ray Hamal Feral Memorial Journalism Fellowship. Also joining me is political analyst Okemfe Liberty. They both join me from New York, venue of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program. Let me begin with you, Alao. It's called the United Nations, but right now it seems anything but united. 4 out of the 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the UN Security Council are upset at the ongoing General Assembly. What does this mean for this year's summit, and how much of unity do you anticipate?
Yes, thank you for having me. All world leaders who are here at the United Nations General Assembly for this session, which is the 70th session. And of course, these world leaders who are the veto-wielding powers are just Biden is the only one who is present for this assembly. And many are worried, especially observers are worried that what does this portend, for this kind of assembly that has different countries' president here. And China, Russia, UK, United Kingdom, they all have different excuses as to why they are not present for this assembly, but it does not portend a good sign at all for the assembly.
Let me bring Mr. Okemfe into this conversation. Many leaders want the annual UN gathering to actually focus more on the climate crisis and their own economic difficulties. But there's also the war in Europe and President Zelensky's attendance. What do you make of the concern that perhaps Zelensky's highly anticipated presence will take the spotlight away from other leaders' appeals and priorities? Mr. Liberty, are you there? Allow, let me get...
All right, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
All right, so thank you for having me. I think, I don't believe it's going to necessarily take the shine away from other European leaders. After all, they've been, they are used to this dance, they do it all the time, and all the attention have usually been focused on the big 5 or the big 7, as we call them. However, I do think that Vladimir Zelensky does have a role here to play because remember he's still fighting the war in Europe. He needs all the international help and assistance he can get, and and again, rightfully so, the attention is for him because he's the only person that's currently fighting a war in Europe, right? And no, the war hasn't necessarily come to the other doorsteps of the other European countries, I mean, of the other European countries and whatnot. So Zelensky is likely going to take opportunity of this moment, try to see as many agreement that he can get. And of course, the war has already been ongoing for more than a year now, and you can tell that amongst the Europeans and even amongst the, with the United States, there's already some sort of a war fatigue, right? What does that next step look like? That is yet to be seen.
So let's bring this home to Nigeria. Perhaps Alao is still there. Let me just hear his thought on this. President Tinubu will be the fifth African leader to speak on the first day of the United Nations General Assembly. Talk to us about what areas of concerns you think he will be addressing when he speaks later tonight.
Yes, the president will be addressing the world leaders today at the General Assembly. And of course, all eyes on the president to give his thoughts on different issues, especially from the home front, Nigeria, and other global issues, especially the SDGs and climate issues. Discussions will also center around democracy in Africa, because in the past couple of months, the president has been faced with issues in Africa, but he has been on the game to ensure that all things is balanced at home front. So world leaders will be expecting to hear from him how has it deepened democracy so far in Africa, especially as the ECOWAS chairman, and also we'll be speaking about the global humanitarian crisis. We'll be speaking about health issues. We'll be speaking about the SDG goals because the UN Secretary General has charged all world leaders to ensure that they accelerate efforts to meet the SDG goals targets. So the president will have an all-encompassing speech, which I believe that we touch on different areas where we'll be delivering a speech today. And then the theme for this year's hunger is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. And so, of course, the president's speech will also be aligning in this area, which everybody expects to listen to today.
I hear you, but he's already met down with the presidents of South Africa and the Union of Comoros Island on the sidelines of the General Assembly. How significant do you think these engagements are, and what do they mean for Nigeria as a country?
Yes, if for those who have been following there before the president left the country, he had an outlined engagement of what to do in New York for this General Assembly. And meeting the South African president and all other delegations that are here, it's a huge one because what he wants to bring out from this summit is that he wants to deepen economic ties with other countries. And this conversation with South African President Ramaphosa is a big one. And you see how to expand economic relations between Nigeria and South Africa, and also all other meetings that we'll also be having there too, other bilateral meetings we'll also be having. So beyond the conversation on economic drive, it's also focused on investment, how to bring more investment to the country, and also how to get the conversation going on how to improve Nigeria at large. So the takeaway is that when he's done here, he's going to go back to the country with all of these meetings that he has had and see how to implement on them.
Mr. Okemfe, this year's list of speakers is still not quite clear, with the increasing number of countries affected by coup d'etat over the past few years. So we understand that the United Nations often refuses to recognize military juntas, but Niger and Gabon are listed as represented by their heads of states, despite both leaders being deposed. Are you expecting any potential surprises in the coming days?
We never know. If Niger, Gabon, if their military coup hasn't been recognized by the UN and the world leaders, I don't necessarily see how they will invite them, to come to New York for the UN General Assembly. Perhaps, and as you know, a lot of these things are done a year ahead of time, right? So there is a possibility that those things were already in the works prior to this being being released. So if I don't have any indication that the military leaders of those two countries are currently in New York City. So if they are not in New York City, then perhaps, of course, the countries still have their own UN representatives and whatnot. They still have an office in the, in New York. So perhaps they're going to be represented not necessarily by the military generals, but essentially by the folks that are already in the UN. And one thing I don't want to touch quickly on with regards to our dear President Tinubu, I'm cautiously optimistic that he's going to use this UN platform as a next step to transition towards the second phase of his 100 days in office. As you know, his first 100 days were marked by turbulence, chaos, and quite frankly, amateur hour, right? There is no reason for, as a president who is the president of 200 plus million people, to make policy pronouncements that have not necessarily baked and cooked and ready for prime time. But you see that the president comes on, he makes a policy announcement, and then the next thing we realize that it's not true. His spokesperson comes and make a policy announcement about visa in the UAE, and then we realize that it's not true. And then you are thinking, wait a minute, who is running the country? Is there a bunch of amateurs that are just running the country right now? So my hope is that this is going to be that transitional moment for him to really get his ducks in a row, right? Get his policy team in order, get his house in order, and make sure that all the cracks and everything that's been going on, that they've figured out a way to alleviate this issue. The time for amateur hour is over. It is not now. So they need to get on with it.
All right. So we're also counting on the mid-term and long-term implication of this potential investment within the country and what that would mean, for the economy of Nigeria at large. But if we can get Alau's contribution on this, particularly with the expected guests for this year's General Assembly, in previous years, when we had similar situations like we had the coup in Myanmar, you recall that it was handled by having the ambassadors from the elected government speak. So is it also expected that perhaps we'll be hearing some appeal from the deposed governments back in Africa?
Well, a few days ago, I spoke with the spokesperson for the SG, and she was giving us an update on what is happening at the assembly. And she said that the assembly, UN, does not recognize coup. So that aside has cleared the issue that whoever is representing Niger, Gabon, because I heard there are two delegations here who have arrived in New York for the General Assembly. And we also have the former president of Niger also, who is also in New York already. So the issue of recognition is what is at stake, and the UN Credentials Committee is who is saddled with the responsibility of recognizing who to speak, at the General Assembly. For this case, I believe that the representative of the elected government might be the one who will be leading the conversation or who will speak at the General Assembly, because the United Nations does not recognize any military junta that came into office to coup.
Indeed. We have to go now, gentlemen. Both of you are following this development closely in New York, where you are currently. There are 6 summits, 1 high-level debate, and perhaps hundreds of side events, all taking place in just a handful of days. Are you concerned that delegations will face a huge challenge keeping up with everything? Let me begin with Alau.
Yes, of course. Different side events, happening on the General Assembly. But as an individual, you must have focus where you want to catch up with or who you want to catch up with. So whatever is the focus is what you follow. There are issues, sidelines happening on climate, sidelines happening on health, happening on financing and investment, so different areas. And then bilateral meetings by head of state and organizations and corporate bodies. So what it is that you have to catch up with the areas you know that is relevant to you, as part of what you are doing. So that's just what I think many people will be doing. As the government will be having their bilateral meetings with specific persons. For example, Nigeria delegation, we have governors who came, with the president, and also they will be joining this bilateral, engagement with other bodies or with other organizations that will be participating here in UN General Assembly.
I hear you. Okay, if it doesn't happen so fast, your head swims. I mean, you just probably can't get a hold of everything.
I live in New York City, and we've been advised this week for us not to drive into the city, so we're all taking public transit. But I completely agree with what the speaker just said. And at the same time, these folks, they should be used to this. It's the same thing that happens every year. They have different meetings. But at the end of the day, it's all about focus and what they want to get from certain meetings. What are their own agenda aside.
Indeed.
So, I usually tell people the UN is not an opportunity for you to just come to New York and gallivant to meet with friends and well-wishers and whatnot. No, you're here on the business and you should have your agenda. And my hope, especially for the Nigerian delegation, is that they should leave the gallivanting aside and make sure they are prepared for business.
Okay, for Liberty, political analyst, journalist Alao Abiodun, a fellow of the United Nations Rahima Farah Memorial Journalism Fellowship. Gentlemen, thank you so much for talking to us on the program this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.